This is Mumbai Port, the largest port in all of India. It has long been the principal gateway to the nation and has played a pivotal role in the development of its economic growth. But India's fortunes as a global trading powerhouse have been diminished for years by some glaring problems. The city that houses Mumbai Port, you guessed it, named Mumbai, is the second most populous city in all of India, with a whopping 22 million residents. And Mumbai is the second most populous city in the now first most populous nation, India. In 2023, India surpassed China as the world's most populous nation, with an incredible 1.45 billion people. That's nearly 18% of the world's total population. But India is not satisfied with just that title alone. They are also ambitiously hoping to take the number one spot in another global title. And that is the title of the world's biggest manufacturing nation. A title which has been held by China for nearly 2 decades. With China's dominance under threat, countries like India and Vietnam are vying for the top spot. But what will it take for India to leap ahead and become the world's number one manufacturing nation? As geopolitical tensions rise and global supply chains shift, the US has been pushing for what they call friendshoring. This means moving critical manufacturing out of China and into more politically friendly nations. And right now, Vietnam and India are in the running. But here's the big question. Can India really catch up to Vietnam and potentially even dethrone the number one China? Well, before we answer that, we must first look at what India has had to overcome in order to get to where they are today on this competitive global stage. Before British colonialism, India was a land of diverse kingdoms. From the Mughal Empire, which left an indelible mark with its architectural marvels, like the Taj Mahal, to the vibrant Maratha Confederacy and the regional states of the Rajputs. The subcontinent was a tapestry of diverse cultures and political entities. The British East India Company arrived in India in the 1600s, initially for trade, but soon exerting extreme political control. By the mid-18th century, the British began consolidating their rule, establishing the British Raj in 1858. The term Raj means reign or rule in Hindi and Urdu, and it signifies Britain's control over India during this time. This period saw significant social and economic changes, including the introduction of Western education and infrastructure, but also, unfortunately, the introduction of British exploitation. The early 20th century was marked by vigorous freedom struggle, led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Subhash Chandra Bose. In 1947, India gained independence from British rule. The post-independence period saw the establishment of a democratic republic, with Nehru as its first prime minister. India embarked on ambitious development plans, adopting a socialist model that included state-led industrialization and a focus of self-sufficiency. The 1960s and 70s were turbulent times with wars with Pakistan, internal strife, and political shifts. The 1990s marked a turning point with economic liberalisation, opening the doors to global markets. Reforms led to rapid growth, transforming India into one of the world's fastest growing economies. The tech boom, especially in IT and software services, positioned India as a global player in technology. Although India has been massively successful in development, even in a relatively short time period, Does India really have the ability to surpass nations like Vietnam and China, who have been ahead of the game in terms of manufacturing and infrastructure for decades now? Well, based on the economic trends, it certainly is not just a far-fetched dream. Pre-COVID India was a beacon of economic growth. By 2022, India had overtaken the United Kingdom to rank as the world's fifth largest economy, with $3.4 trillion in nominal GDP. And by 2023, it overtook China to become the world's most populous nation. Due to COVID in 2020, India's real GDP contracted by 5.8%, but in 2021, it then grew by 9.1%. By 2022, it had slowed to 7.2% compared to China's economy, which had contracted by 0.4% in 2020. Its first negative growth since 1976. There are speculations that the sharp advancement of infrastructure and the availability of a youthful, motivated labour population, both in terms of number and quality, may have been responsible for India's rate of economic growth. India's transition from a mixed planned economy to a mixed middle income and developing social market economy has brought notable growth and hence heightened India's position in the race to become the next #1 manufacturing power. Nearly 70% of India's GDP is driven by domestic consumption, making its population density an added advantage to its economic growth. Although India's growth is highly commendable, the strength of the Chinese economy should not be underestimated. Over time, many news outlets have labelled China a joiner and India a builder in the journey of economic growth. This implies that many believe China leveraged more on foreign partnerships for its economic growth, while India has built its economy from scratch by internal revenue generation. However, China has recently shown that made in China is not just a catchphrase. Its manufacturing production rate rose from 5% to a massive 35%, while industrialization in India rose from 1% to 3%. India, on the other hand, has consistently strengthened its bonds with foreign countries, notably the US. The competition gets fierce here, leaving one wondering if, with a few more international partnerships, India can close the now closer than ever gap between its manufacturing economy and that of its competition, China. The establishment of most of America's top firms and sizable technology operations in India, continual reliance on Indian-based IT capabilities, and growing reliance on India for critical high-tech services are indicators of India's projected future success. Beyond IT, India can assist the US in reducing its dependence on China's manufacturing sector, which has become a key component of internal US political rhetoric. Take, for example, the former US President Donald Trump's many public statements on US dependence on Chinese manufacturing. But there's a big problem here. India's reliance itself on Chinese imports. Despite India's push to be a self-reliant manufacturing hub, India's dependence on Chinese imports is actually on the rise. This has major implications for US efforts to friendshore, aka reduce US reliance on China. While India has been aggressively ramping up its production in key industries, it is increasingly importing critical components from China. According to trade figures, nearly a third of India's imports come from China, covering everything from electronics and renewable energy to pharmaceuticals. In fact, imports from China have been growing at double the rate of overall imports into India. For electronic components like circuit boards and batteries, nearly 2/3 of these imports now come from China. And the volume of these imports has tripled over the past 5 years. Now, you might wonder, what's the big deal with this dependency? Well, as Shripana Pathak, an associate professor at Jindal University, points out, unless India can break free from relying on China for these crucial components, the goal of de-risking or reducing dependency on Chinese supply chains will remain out of reach. And it's not just electronics. India's pharmaceutical sector, a major exporter to the US, is also feeling the pinch. While India used to produce much of its own pharmaceutical ingredients, it now sources a significant portion from China. For instance, India relies on China for key ingredients like paracetamol. From 2007 to 2022, China's share in Indian imports of chemicals and pharmaceuticals has surged by over 50%. This growing dependency on Chinese imports for essential pharmaceutical ingredients has been accelerating in the past 5 years. This trend poses a challenge not only for India, but also for global supply chain strategies aimed at reducing reliance on China. So, what does this mean for the US policymakers and global supply chains? It's a reality check that shows how complex and interconnected global trade has become. As India continues to grow as a manufacturing hub, it will need to address its dependency on Chinese imports to truly achieve the diversification that many countries are striving for. Aside from the troubling effects of India's current reliance on Chinese imports, another challenge to India's game plan of becoming the world's #1 manufacturing hub is Vietnam's competitive edge. Right now, the current frontrunner to China's #1 spot is Vietnam. Vietnam has been a manufacturing hub for years, especially in electronics. Last year, Vietnam's exports hit a whopping $97 billion. In contrast, India's exports trailed at around $76 billion. Clearly, Vietnam has a significant head start. Vietnam's expertise in electronics gives it a competitive edge, and India is still playing catch-up. Add to the fact that Vietnam has been cozying up to the US for over a decade thanks to their trade and investment deals. And Vietnam may seem like an unbeatable economic opponent. But India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to the White House has certainly warmed US-India relations. Despite this diplomatic boost, Vietnam's head start in electronics manufacturing and its existing trade agreements have given it a clear edge. But it's not just about diplomatic ties. Vietnam's simplicity in regulations also plays a crucial role. According to Mukesh Aghi from the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum, Vietnam's single national policy is more straightforward compared to India's complex regional regulations. This simplicity helps Vietnam scale its manufacturing efficiently. So, what's holding India back? One major hurdle is the import tax. India currently imposes a 10% duty on ICT goods, while Vietnam's average is around 5%. This higher tax was initially meant to protect local industries, but is now seen as a barrier to attracting foreign investment. India has started to address this by lowering import taxes on specific components, like those used in mobile phones. For instance, they reduced duties on certain metal and plastic parts from 15% to 10%. This is a step in the right direction, but it's not a panacea. Additionally, India's infrastructure remains a significant challenge, especially when it comes to the efficiency of India's ports, like, for example, Mumbai port. While a ship can be unloaded and on its way to factories in Singapore within hours, the same process in India could take days. This inefficiency is a major deterrent for foreign investors looking to scale down their reliance on China. India is responding to this problem by investing heavily in infrastructure, with plans to spend $30.7 billion on improving railways and logistics. But catching up to China's infrastructure, which is about a decade ahead, will be a monumental task for India. However, with US global pressure to move towards friendshoring and away from China, the US is influencing nations to move more investments to friendlier India, rather than Vietnam or China. Vietnam's historically warm relationship with China, which are both technically communist nations, might be a double-edged sword here. While it strengthens their trade ties, it could also be a concern for US companies wary of political entanglements with communist governments. This geopolitical dynamic might give India a unique advantage if it can prove itself as a more stable and reliable partner with sufficient infrastructure. While India is making strides, it faces significant challenges in competing with Vietnam's established manufacturing prowess. Lowering import taxes and improving infrastructure are crucial steps. But will these measures be enough to shift the balance in India's favour? Can India rise to the top of Asia's manufacturing sector? Or will Vietnam's head start prove too formidable to overcome? Only time will tell. But it is clear that the US is placing its thumb on the geopolitical scale in favour of India.